For centuries, the Ottoman Harem has been imagined as a place of luxury, intrigue, and endless pleasure. But for the vast majority of women who lived there, daily life was defined by routine, discipline, and waiting. Most entered the imperial harem at Topkapı Palace in Istanbul as teenagers. Most would never leave, and most would spend their lives preparing for a future that, in practice, never arrived. They woke at the same hour, followed the same rules, learned the same skills: silence, obedience, restraint. This is not the story of the most powerful women of the empire. It is the story of what life was actually like for the majority. A day in the life of an Ottoman harem woman. Most women entered the imperial harem at a young age, typically between 12 and 16. Many were enslaved, taken as captives, or purchased through established networks. Others were presented as gifts to the palace. Once inside, their former identities were erased. Names, languages, religions, and family ties were replaced with new ones. This was not symbolic, it was administrative. Women were converted to Islam, given new names, and enrolled into a system that treated them less as individuals and more as assets to be trained. A typical day began early. Women rose at dawn, not by choice, but by schedule. The harem operated on strict timetables, enforced by senior women and eunuchs. The morning was devoted to cleanliness and order. Bathing, grooming, and preparing shared spaces were not optional activities. They were expectations tied to rank. In the Ottoman worldview, discipline and beauty were inseparable. Order in the body reflected order in the household. In practice, this meant that appearance was monitored closely. Hair, posture, clothing, and movement were all subject to correction. Much of the day was spent in instruction. Contrary to popular belief, the imperial harem functioned as an elite training institution. Women were educated in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, Arabic, poetry, music, embroidery, and court etiquette. Some were trained in calligraphy or bookkeeping. Others learned ceremonial performance or household administration. This education served a purpose. Women who demonstrated discipline, intelligence, and loyalty could rise within the hierarchy. A small number might eventually serve the sultan directly. Others would be married off to high-ranking officials, strengthening political alliances. In this sense, the harem was both a place of confinement and a path to social elevation. The harem was organized with meticulous precision. At the bottom were novices and servants. Above them were trained attendants. Higher still were favored companions. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, who wielded immense authority. Rank determined everything: where one slept, what one wore, who one spoke to, how one moved. Even silence was hierarchical. In practice, advancement required absolute obedience. Favor was earned through reliability, discretion, and conformity. Mistakes were not merely personal failures, they were disruptions to order. Privacy, in the modern sense, did not exist. Movement was restricted. Communication was monitored. Every corridor, courtyard, and chamber was controlled by eunuchs who served as guards, messengers, and enforcers. The presence of eunuchs was not incidental, it was structural. They ensured that access to the women of the harem remained tightly regulated, and that authority flowed upward, not outward. In practice, this meant that women lived under constant observation. Even informal interactions carried political weight. Only a small fraction of women would ever encounter the sultan directly. Fewer still would bear his children. Contrary to fantasy, intimacy was rare and heavily regulated. The purpose of these encounters was dynastic, not romantic. A woman who gave birth to a son gained status, but also scrutiny. Her life became more constrained, not less. In practice, Motherhood bound a woman's fate to palace politics. Her survival depended on her child's prospects. Meals were communal and quiet. Seating reflected rank. Conversation was restrained. The harem was not a space of leisure in the modern sense. Free time was structured, supervised, and purposeful. Even entertainment, music, storytelling, games, served to reinforce hierarchy and cohesion. In practice, companionship existed, but trust was fragile. Favor could shift. Information could be weaponized. Disobedience was addressed swiftly. Punishments ranged from demotion and isolation to expulsion from the palace. Severe infractions could result in imprisonment or exile. Physical punishment was not unknown, but social erasure was often more effective. To be reassigned, married off abruptly, or removed from palace life altogether was a profound rupture. In practice, fear functioned as a stabilizing force. From the outside, the imperial harem appears to be a paradox. It was an institution built on confinement, hierarchy, and legal enslavement. Yet it produced some of the most influential women in Ottoman history. It was designed to limit access and autonomy, yet it placed women closer to the center of power than almost anyone else in the empire. In practice, this paradox defined daily life. Most women in the harem would never wield influence. They would live and die within the system, rising only modestly in rank, their lives shaped by routine rather than ambition. But the structure itself allowed for exceptions, and those exceptions mattered. A woman who bore a son entered a different category altogether. Her status increased, but so did her vulnerability. She became entangled in the politics of succession, a process that was often violent and unpredictable. In practice, influence was never guaranteed. It depended on survival, of the woman, of her child, and of her alliances. This reality shaped behavior throughout the harem. Caution was valued more than brilliance, silence more than honesty, reliability more than affection. The women who succeeded were rarely those who stood out. They were those who endured. A single day in the harem may appear uneventful. Wake, wash, study, serve, obey, sleep. But repeated over years, this routine became a life. In practice, time itself was one of the harem's most powerful tools. By controlling movement, relationships, and expectations, the institution narrowed the range of possible futures. For some women, the harem offered stability, education, and material security unavailable elsewhere. For others, it represented a permanent severing from family, homeland, and choice. Both experiences could exist simultaneously. It is tempting to ask whether life in the harem was better or worse than alternatives available to women in the broader Ottoman world. But that question risks missing the point. The harem was not designed for individual fulfillment. It was designed for continuity. Everything, from daily schedules to emotional restraint, served the needs of the dynasty, not the person. In practice, this meant that identity was gradually reshaped. Ambition learned to hide itself. Hope learned to adapt. Obedience became habit rather than burden. And that, perhaps, is the most difficult aspect to reconstruct. Not the architecture or the clothing or the rules, but the quiet normalization of constraint. A day in the life of an Ottoman harem woman was not defined by indulgence or idleness. It was defined by discipline, education, surveillance, and hierarchy. The harem was neither a romantic fantasy nor a simple prison. It was a system designed to produce order, loyalty, and dynastic continuity. For the women who lived within it, life unfolded not as a story of passion, but as a negotiation between constraint and opportunity. Understanding that reality requires restraint of our own assumptions. And perhaps that is why the harem continues to resist easy explanation.